Today we are putting the Skinks toe to toe to figure out which one really is the best pet. And the reason we came up with these four is because it's what I believe are the top four up and coming Skinks that are both rising in popularity and are within most people's budget. Those four Skinks include number one, the Kenyan Zebra Skink, number two, the Schneider Skink, number three, the Fire Skink, and last but not least, number four, the Emerald Tree Skink. But I don't want you guys just to pay attention to the overall score. You only know what you're looking for, and if one rates higher in a specific category than the other, that's something to keep in mind. We're going to be scoring each one in several categories on a score based from 1 to 10, 1 being the lowest, 10 being the highest. Whoever has the most points at the end is going to be our clear winner. So let's get right into it. So let's start off with category number one, and that is going to be availability. So even if it's top rated or the best pet skink, does it really matter if it's not available? And we really need to break this down a little bit between availability in terms of captive and availability in terms of being wild caught. And we'll have to really figure out a way to average out that score. So let's start off with number one, the Emerald Tree Skink. The Emerald Tree Skink is still, I would say, predominantly traded wild caught, but is trending more toward captive bred, which is fantastic to see. A lot of people are breeding Emerald Tree Skinks. However, the demand right now is significantly higher than the supply, leading to very long lead times and wait list in order to get yourself a captive bred Emerald Tree Skink. And I would like to note, it's not very easy getting them wild caught at the moment either. Now, I do always 100% of the time recommend going captive bred when available. And for those reasons, the Emerald Tree Skink is going to get a rating of 4 out of 10. While they are very possible to obtain, you have to do a lot of research. You've got to find a reputable breeder and you've got to get on a wait list. Definitely obtainable, but you're going to have to wait for them, which is why we're giving this a rating of 4 out of 10. So then we have the Kenyan Zebra Skinks. And we're going to skip the wild caught factor here because there's no reason to get wild caught Kenyan Zebra Skinks. They are pretty available, captive bred. So we're only going to rate them based on a score of captive bred availability. And for the Zebra Skinks, I see a lot of upward trends in availability for breeders out there. There's several of them on Morph Market right now. There's several online. For the Zebra Skink availability, they are getting a score of 8 out of 10. Moving on to the Fire Skinks. Now this one is a little bit more difficult to rate because while they are pretty easy to obtain, they are predominantly still wild caught. Again, I see a lot more breeders coming up the chain, a lot more popularity in breeding Fire Skinks, which is amazing. However, they're not extremely easy to obtain captive bred. There are a few listings on Morph Market. There's a few available online, but they're not readily available where anybody's just going to be able to go out and get captive bred Fire Skinks right now. But in terms of wild caught, it's fairly easy to get wild caught Fire Skinks. You can really get them at any time, any point. Very easy. Again, always go for captive bred. Even if that means waiting a little bit or finding a breeder and getting on a wait list, go captive bred. Support those people that are putting the time and effort and breeding these amazing skinks. But in terms of availability, we are giving the Fire Skink a 6 out of 10, and that score would increase once we get more captive breeders working with Fire Skinks. To wrap up availability, we have the Schneider Skink. So, as most of us know, there is an absolute score of 0 when it comes to captive bred Schneider Skinks. It's impossible to get a captive bred Schneider. There are definitely not enough people trying to breed these guys, and they're absolutely amazing, so it blows my mind that we don't have more people working with them. We do have a few, but those who do work with them generally don't tend to let their captives go. And when it comes to wild caught availability, you have about 2 times a year where they're very available, and then the rest of the year it's kind of slow. So for the Schneider Skinks, in terms of availability, we are giving them an overall score of 3 out of 10. So for our next category, we are going to be talking about maintenance and upkeep. The higher the score, the easier the maintenance and upkeep. The lower the score, the more difficult and hard it is to maintain the species. So first off, let's talk about emerald tree skinks. They are a social species, which makes them very cool. They typically live in colonies, so I do recommend having at least 2 or 3 emerald tree skinks and not keep them solo. In doing so, this does require a pretty large enclosure. I do recommend at least a 36 by 18 by 36. That takes up a lot of space in your house, but you won't regret it one bit when you see them running around that entire enclosure. In addition to the big enclosure, they do require a basking spot, and they do require UVB, which is going to be a linear T5, no coils, no bulbs. Get that linear T5 UVB for your emerald tree skinks. And they're gonna need a humidity, a constant humidity of 70%, which might include a fogger to make it a little bit easier. But then if you add the fogger, you gotta clean that fogger every week because bacteria builds up in them super easy and super quick. In addition to that, they do require misting often, or you can get a misting system. Again, clean that misting system pretty often. And those emerald tree skinks, they do like to eat. They love to eat, they love to hunt. They do require live bugs, but they will also accept things like crested gecko diet for a treat every now and then. So for all the reasons mentioned, we are giving the emerald tree skink a score of 5 out of 10. So I do have to rate it a little bit low, only due to the constant humidity that they require for a new reptile owner. Might be pretty difficult to achieve. So as I always recommend, make sure you do all of your research prior to buying any reptile, but it is a little bit difficult to achieve for a new reptile owner, certainly because bioactive is going to be the absolute best way to go here. And without a doubt, having a drainage layer and just requires a lot of upkeep. So let's now jump over to the fire skinks, who are also going to require a humidity level of about 70% fairly frequently. However, with the fire skink, the humidity, or the importance of humidity, really lies in the dirt, as opposed to the emerald tree skinks, where they need a constant humidity from top to bottom at 70%. A little bit easier to maintain fire skinks with their dirt being the most humid. Although they do require a little bit of a higher humidity above ground as well, it's not going to be so hard to keep up as, let's say, the emerald tree skinks, where a fogger is probably going to be your best friend. The fire skinks do also require a basking spot, although it's on the lower end. They don't need exceedingly high temperatures like a Schneider skink might. They do spend a lot of their time underground. They do also eat live insects, which is going to be a requirement of their diet, as well as other things that you can feed them. For example, Repashy grub pie, bluey buffet, so on and so forth. There's literally a ton of things that I could list off for diet of fire skink, but do your own research. This is not a care guide. We are simply rating them on the knowledge we already have. So I think one of the more difficult parts of having a fire skink is if they are pretty active above ground. Not all of them are, but if they are one of the active or more active fire skinks, you're going to be changing that water bowl frequently. They love to run around and track dirt through their water. It's going to be a little bit of a pain in the butt to clean it so often, but it is a requirement. They need that clean, steady, clean bowl of water. So for those reasons, we are giving the fire skink a final score of 7 out of 10. Overall, pretty easy to maintain. I think most people who have any sort of background in reptiles is going to find fire skinks pretty easy to take care of. And they require a minimum of 40 gallons, so you're not going to have such a big enclosure as some of the others might require. But a 40-gallon tank for a single fire skink is absolutely fine. Moving over to another one that can live in a 40-gallon tank, we have the Kenyan Zebra Skink. And this is where the humidity is going to get a little bit funny, because while the other two that we talked about require a constant humidity, Kenyan Zebra Skinks require a humidity in one side and a humidity in the other side of their tank, which might be a little bit difficult for newer reptile owners to maintain. So they require a humid side of their enclosure that'll be above 50% humidity, and a dry side of their enclosure that's going to be under 50% humidity. So it'll level out about 30-40% on one side, and your other side is going to be around 50-60%, which spikes up during the night when you missed it or in the morning when you missed it. But on average, it's going to stay around that 50-60% on one side and 30-40% on the other side. They also require a basking spot, roughly the same as a fire skink, nothing too excessive. And just like all the species we're going to mention today, they do require a T5 linear UVB. These guys are absolute pigs. They are going to eat much more than any of the other reptiles that we're talking about today, especially when it comes to live insects. You are going to have to keep quite a bit of live insects readily available for the zebra skinks. Absolute pigs. They love to eat and they love live insects. So that's going to bring our zebra skinks to a total score of 6 out of 10. Now we're going to move over to the Schneider skinks. The Schneider skinks, again, can live solo in a 40-gallon. If you're going to do pairs or trios, I would certainly recommend a 4x2x2, but that goes with really any of them, the fire skinks or the Kenyan Zebra Skinks. All good in a 40-gallon, but if you plan on keeping them in a group or in pairs, you should really bump that up to a 4x2x2. In addition to that, they do require a basking spot that's going to be exceedingly higher than the others that we talk about today, coming in at around 110 plus degrees, as well as a bit of a higher UVB. So you're going to be looking more toward a 12 to 14% UVB, whereas the others might be okay with a 7 to 12% UVB. And in terms of eating, the Schneider skinks are going to eat live insects as well. They're not going to eat nearly as much as the other three, but they do seem to be a little bit more picky than the others as well. Along with live insects, you can also feed grub pie, bluey buffet. And then when we start talking about humidity, it's going to be a little more controversial. I think there's a lot of opinions when it comes to humidity of Schneider skinks. A lot of people keep them very dry, going down into that arid 30 to 40%. Some people believe that they should be at 50% plus. Just depends on who you talk to. What I do personally is I set them up kind of like a zebra skink, whereas I'll have a humid side on one side of the tank, and I have mine in 4x2x2s, but I have a humid side on one side that's around 50 to 60%, and then the dry side, which gets down to about that 20 to 30%. But again, this could be pretty difficult for some people to achieve, and for that reason, they are also going to score a total 6 out of 10. And you may be thinking at this point that we are scoring them pretty harsh, but I do want to make sure that people understand that although people may think that these are all starter reptiles or beginner reptiles, it does take quite a bit of effort to maintain and upkeep their enclosures. And there is a proper way to take care of your reptiles, and the minimums are not the best way to do it. I know a lot of guides will say the minimum this, the minimum that. Listen, I understand and I get it, but minimum is only the very least you can do, and if you only want to do the very least for your reptile, you should not get that reptile. Regardless how critical and harsh we are being absolutely fair across the board. So no matter if you think we're scoring lower than we should, it's going to be the same for all of them. So in the end, we're still going to get the same result. All right, so next up, we're going to talk about observation and interaction, not to be confused with handleability of the reptile, specifically talking about interacting, watching them, how active they are in their enclosures. I think first up, we are going to have the emerald tree skinks, and let me just say they are absolutely probably one of the best reptiles when it comes to observing, interacting, and watching them run around with each other. It's really, I don't know if there's another reptile that I would recommend if you were specifically thinking about just an animal that you can observe all day long. And for that reason, I don't think there's any need for much more conversation. The emerald tree skinks are going to be scoring a 9 out of 10 when it comes to observation and interaction. And then we have the fire skinks. So the fire skinks, unfortunately, are going to take a little bit of a hit here because while they are fun to watch when they are above ground, you might not see your fire skinks for long periods of time. They do like to be burrowed, they do like to be underground, and for that reason, you might not be able to observe and interact with them very often. I'm not saying you can't interact or you can't observe your fire skinks, but we do have to make this into general observation, and most fire skinks just enjoy being underground. And for that reason, we are giving the fire skink a 4 out of 10 for observation and interaction. Moving over to the Kenyan Zebra Skinks. The Kenyan Zebra Skinks, while they do enjoy to burrow, predominantly when they sleep, they are mostly above ground during the day. And again, they are social. They can live in pairs or trios, which makes them more fun to observe and watch how they interact with each other. However, Kenyan Zebra Skinks are pretty lazy. They mostly just hang out under their basking spot and bask and eat and don't really do much aside from that. You'll see them running around and interacting with each other every now and then, but for the most part, you're just going to see them laying under their basking light. And for that reason, we're going to give them a total score of 6 out of 10. Moving over to the Schneider Skink. It really comes down to the schedules. I see a lot of questions online for people talking about this, so I think a lot of people just don't quite understand it to the full degree, or don't think about it when they are purchasing a Schneider Skink. But Schneider Skinks are really only active for about 5 hours a day, maybe 6, and then they will burrow for the rest of the day into the night. Mine specifically, they will come out when the lights come on around 9 o'clock in the morning, and by about 3 or 4 o'clock, they are all burrowed or back in their hiding spots, ready to go back to sleep. But you do have a good window within that 5, 6, 7 hour time frame where they do have their little zoomy period every day, and they just zip around that enclosure. It's a ton of fun to watch, especially if they're interacting with each other. But after they get their zoomies out, they are gone and ready for bed. So for that reason, we are giving the Schneider Skinks a total score of 6 out of 10. So let's roll right into handleability. And this one might be a little bit of a surprise for most people who are looking at Emerald Tree Skinks. So I know there's a lot of videos online that show Emerald Tree Skinks and how fun they are and how much they like to just jump out and hang out with you and leaping out of their enclosure to run up and down your arms. Very inquisitive, curious skinks. It's all true. Every bit of it is true. However, that being said, only about 50 to 60% of tree skinks are actually going to display that behavior. A lot of them are very skittish and want nothing to do with you, and do not want to come out of their enclosure. Again, you can spend the time and acclimating them to their new environment, acclimating them to being handled, coming out of that enclosure. But just know that not all emerald tree skinks are going to be like what you see in videos. A lot are, but a lot of them are going to be much more skittish than what you think. And another thing we really need to discuss is emerald tree skinks really aren't handleable at all. They hate being handled. Yeah, surprise! Emerald tree skinks hate being handled. With that said though, emerald tree skinks love to handle you. Why they do love to jump out of their enclosure, run up and down your arms, hang out on your shoulders, or zip under your hoodie hood and just chill there for multiple hours a day, they do not like being picked up. They absolutely hate being picked up, and they hate being grabbed. They hate being held in your hand. They want to be handled on their own terms. I think it's just something very important to note if you're looking for emerald tree skinks. Really consider this, because unlike a blue tongue skink that you can just pick up and hold in your hand for multiple hours a day, you're not going to be able to do that with an emerald tree skink. So although it's a different kind of handling, whereas they're handling you and you're not handling them, it is still a lot of fun. And for that reason, we are going to give them a total score of 7 out of 10 for handling. Then we move over to the fire skinks. So fire skinks, in terms of handleability, I gotta say that you really need to put in your work here. Fire skinks can be one of the most rewarding skinks to actually get to the point where you can frequently handle them and handle them often, because not only do they like to be burrowed for the majority of the time, but if you can get them to actually come out and hang out with you and actually tolerate being handled for a longer period of time, it's very rewarding, because that doesn't happen too often with fire skinks. Generally speaking, they are pretty skittish. They don't like to be picked up too often, and they will burrow as soon as they see you trying to grab them. So although they are very rewarding once you get them to that handling, we got to keep them a little bit low on the scoreboard and we're going to give them a 4 out of 10 for overall handleability. So moving over to the Kenyan Zebra Skinks. Zebra Skinks are actually great at handling. They're one of the best, in my opinion, of skinks that you can handle. With that being said, you do need to handle them frequently and often in order to get them to that point. If you buy Zebra Skink adults, they might be very skittish. You don't know how the last person interacted with them on a daily basis. I would highly recommend getting Zebra Skink babies if you're going to go for Zebra Skinks and handle them frequently and often. And it'll be very rewarding at the end of the day because they will be some of the most handleable reptiles that you can possibly own. And in my experience, which is kind of crazy, my babies are actually one of the most handleable. So once they're born, I would say in the first 2 weeks, I could pick them up and they would hang out in my hand for as long as I wanted them to. It was absolutely crazy. It kind of blew my mind for the first time. And if you just continue on that path and keep them used to being handled, it'll do wonders for them once they become adults. So the Kenyan Zebra Skink, overall handleability, we are going to give them an 8 out of 10. And then we have the Schneider Skinks. I think this probably is one of the most handleable reptiles that exists. I know you might be thinking, oh, bearded dragon or blue-tongued skink, but let me just say, you can pick a Schneider skink out of the wild and that thing will let you handle it, let you hold it. It'll hang out with you. It'll jump out of its enclosure and just run up to your shoulder. Schneider skinks are absolutely amazing when it comes to handling. There are exceptions, of course. I have seen people who have got Schneider skinks that are, of course, wild caught since there's zero captive market currently, that have been a little bit spicy and didn't want to be handled, or they might be a little bit bitey. But overall experience, I would say that Schneider skinks, even being wild caught, are extremely handleable and one of the most handleable reptiles that you can possibly own. And once we actually get the captive market up and going and we get a captive market for Schneider skinks, just imagine the possibility at that point. And for that reason, the Schneider skink is going to get a 9 out of 10 for handleability. And then the last category we're going to talk about is just the overall awesome factor of each of the skinks. And this really is how they appear, how they look, and how they display, just the overall look of the skink in general. So we'll start off with the Emerald Tree Skink, and while there are really no morphs for an Emerald Tree Skink, there are localities. But at the end of the day, they're not much different. Some might be a little bit bronze in color, some might be that pure green, you might have the green with some black speckling. But overall, most Emerald Tree Skinks really just look the same. They're that solid green color, which is a beautiful green. So definitely don't want to discount the fact that, you know, the color that they are is a beautiful color. For the Emerald Tree Skink, we're going to give them an overall score of 7 out of 10. Flipping over to the Kenyan Zebra Skink, I would say this one's a little bit difficult. If you see my last video on Kenyan Zebra Skinks, you will note that I did potentially maybe call them ugly when they're adults. But in any case, for the baby Zebra Skinks, they would score significantly high, but that would be biased and unfair of me to rate them solely based on as a baby. So we're going to have to go to the adults, and if you've seen the adult Zebra Skinks, they are adorable in their own way. You really have to love a Kenyan Zebra Skink for what they are and who they are to really appreciate how beautiful they are. So the Kenyan Zebra Skink, we're going to have to go with a score of 3 out of 10. While they may not be lookers, they do have a lot to make up for it. And then we head into the fire skinks. So fire skinks are some of the coolest looking skinks there are. I mean, those bright red colors with those black stripes, I mean, they just look absolutely amazing. Not only that, but there are some really cool morphs that are popping up for fire skinks. A few different breeders that are around. They're not very widely available at this point. I think there's only really a few people working with the other or the specific morphs. If you're more interested in that, definitely check it out. I'm sure you can find it on Google. Hit the Facebook groups, Morph Market. Take a look at all the different morphs. Really cool. But in any case, fire skinks, one of the coolest looking skinks that you can possibly own. For that reason, we're going to rate them a 9 out of 10. And last but not least, to wrap it up, we have the Schneider skinks. Schneider skinks are my absolute favorite color when it comes to orange. I love orange. I love orange on reptiles. But again, we're not being biased, so we're going to move forward without the consideration of oranges just being the best color. Most Schneider skinks really look the same. They're gray. They have orange spots, orange stripes, orange clumps on their legs. Some of them have freckles, some of them don't have freckles, but in general, Schneider skinks really appear be the same. And again, not discounting the fact that they just look cool, but there's not a wide variety of different Schneider skinks that, no morphs, and all the localities really look the same as well. So beyond looking the same, they still look very cool, but nowhere as cool as a fire skink, of course. So we have to rate the Schneider skink overall at a score of 6 out of 10. All right, so now it is time for the final results. If you guys made it through the whole video, I do appreciate it. I know it was a long one, but we really had a lot of details to go through. And looking at the results, I couldn't be more unbiased because not exactly what I was expecting and not what I would have put in my list of favorites. So I think it goes without saying that I probably would have put Schneider skinks as my number 1, but they actually tied for last place. So that being said, let's go through the results here real quick. I have them written down. We have the fire skinks with a total score of 30. Their high score was maintenance and upkeep, as well as looks. And their low scores were observation, as well as handling. Emerald Tree Skinks, total score of 32, and their high score was observation and handling, and their low scores were availability and maintenance and upkeep. So exactly what the fire skinks were lacking, the ETS were high scores on. What the ETS were lacking, the fire skinks were high scores on. I found that pretty interesting. Moving on to the Schneider skinks, tied with the fire skinks at 30 total. We have a high score of handling and obviously a low score of availability, and really we're talking about captive bred availability. Over to Kenyan Zebra Skinks. Last but also not least, they did come in second place after the Emerald Tree Skinks with availability at their high point, tied with handling, as well as looks being their downfall. Poor Kenyan Zebra Skinks. I feel so bad saying that, but it's got to be said. It's got to be said. So anyway, hope you guys enjoyed the video. Again, thank you guys for sticking around. Please hit the like and subscribe if you're interested in watching more content, and we'll see you guys in the next one.